In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about romantic love. And really, the theme of this chapter is that um, we often think about romantic love in a really specific type of way. It looks a particular way because that's what we see often in movies and pop culture references. Um, Particularly, Eros is something that we see often in pop culture representations or mania. Um, but what I want to focus on, or encourage you all to focus on, is this idea that romantic love is more plural. There's more ways of thinking about it, there's more ways of doing it than just this singular type um, of idea of what love should look like. So I would hope that you would embrace a more plural rather than singular perspective, because every relationship is different, and even in each relationship, love will change over time. It will look different in different days, even. So it's important to take a more plural aspect of about a plural perspective when thinking about romantic love. Now, there's a lot of different types of romantic love, which you'll want to look over in your textbook. Like I said, there's some that are more popular, but all the different types really have. Um, we can see these different types of love. Not all of them are necessarily great, but they're all ones that we see in contemporary culture. So you want to look over those. Um, Relationships are characterized by perception, diversity, choice, and commitment, and tensions and communication. And out of all those different characteristics, I wanted to talk a little bit about the tensions that we see in interpersonal relationships, and particularly romantic relationships. So, dialectical tensions are, if you can think about a spectrum, and there's three different dialectical tensions that they talk about in your book. And one is openness versus protection, the other is autonomy versus connection, and the other is novelty versus predictability. And each of these different tensions, you can kind of see how they play out in your relationship. So, openness versus protection is this idea that we want to be open with our partners. We want to share with them, use self disclosure to become closer to them, but there's also an element of protection that we want. We don't want to open ourselves up too much to the other person and be completely vulnerable. So you have to kind of negotiate on what end of the spectrum you are. Autonomy versus connection is another really important one. This is the degree to which we feel connected versus we feel totally separate. So, oftentimes, moving in together is going to be a really big step towards connection, right? You're leaving these autonomous living situations and coming together. But you see how this connection is really a big one. If one person pulls away, the other person tends to want to get closer, and that tension you have to navigate. And then novelty versus predictability, and this is where we want things to stay the same and be sort of the same day, predictable day in and day out, versus we want something new and exciting. And so you see how that tension can be navigated, and different couples are going to want different levels of these elements, and or these tensions. So some couples are going to want more connection versus less autonomy, but they're going to want a lot of novelty. And sometimes negotiating these tensions is going to change over the course of the relationship, of course. A lot of times early in a relationship, you're going to want a lot of protection to protect yourself. You're not going to want to be as open, and then as you get to know each other, if you look back at social penetration theory, right, we're going to peel back the layers of the onion. We're going to get to know each other better. And then as we get to know each other, then we start saying, well, things are too predictable. Now we want a little bit more novelty. So you see how there's these tensions that we're constantly navigating. There's a lot of different things that go into what we think is, or what causes us to find another person attractive. And I really like reading through these in your book, so you want to look through them. There's a lot of different sort of elements of attraction and then these effects that they have on us. So we really like people that like us. So if people show a lot of interest in us, we're maybe more likely to find them attractive. Um, if we see a lot of similarity in another person, this is called birds of a feather effect, and we're going to kind of think that they're more attractive because they're more like us. And then the physical attractiveness aspect, if we think another person is beautiful in some way, or handsome, or however you want to describe it, we're going to think that they're better people, and we're going to like them more. So, and there's a few other ones besides that, but those are some of the more interesting ones when thinking about sort of how do we become attracted to other people. And then there's stages of coming together and coming apart in terms of relationships. And certainly some people never dissolve relationships. Lots of marriages are, they still stay together no matter what. But sort of if you look at a life cycle of a relationship, for those people that do dissolve it eventually, they go through specific steps. And even the people that stay together go through sort of specific steps to get there. But it's important to realize these steps are not like, oh, we've done this step, now we're moving on to this step. They can kind of happen simultaneously. You can go back and then go forward. And so it's important to not think of this too linearly. This is really a way of thinking about it, not necessarily the actual way that relationships always progress. But there's initiating, experimenting, intensifying, integrating, and then bonding. And those are the 5 stages that we go through to sort of to have a relationship. And then if we decide to dissolve the relationship, there's also 5 stages that we kind of go through on that other end of the spectrum. And that's differentiating, circumventing, stagnating, avoidance, and terminating. And those obviously are sadder than the coming together. But it's important to remember that sometimes dissolving your relationship, if you're not happy in it, is not necessarily a negative thing. The other thing I wanted to point to quickly is that your book gives you a lot of really interesting ways to sort of maintain your relationship. If it's your goal, if it's your relational goal to maintain the relationship, then there's some really interesting ways of going through it. Positivity, assurance, sharing tasks, acceptance is a really, really big one. Self-disclosure, relational talk, and social networks. And so those are all of the different sort of strategies that your book points to, and I'm sure you can think of others or think of examples that fall into these different relational strategies that you all have used. But the one that is interesting to me and that I find to be particularly important when talking to people about sort of romantic relationships is relationship talk. And this is where you talk about the relationship itself. And this is where a lot of what we call turning points happen. The conversation that you have with your partner about should we be exclusive or not. That's what we call a turning point. It's this moment in time that really takes the relationship from one stage to the next stage, or perhaps backwards, right? You could have a relational talk and say, should we be exclusive or not, and decide not, and then the relationship goes in a different direction. But either way, it's these moments in time that really define sort of the arc of the relationship. How does it look? And relationship talk can be great. It can also be detrimental sometimes if you talk too much about the relationship itself versus just, doing things together or engaging in positivity where you're, cheerful and optimistic around the other person, or reminding the other person about your devotion to them, which would be under the category of assurances. So there's all these different strategies, but relationship talk is a really interesting one because that can be where we see a lot of turning points in relationships. the chapter ends on talking about the dark side of dating and romantic relationships, and this is an important one to remember. We always have these sort of rainbows and butterflies idea about love as a culture, and it's important to remember that not every romantic relationship is like that, and I'm sure many of us have been in relationships that have not been pleasant. In fact, those are the relationships that really can define you as a person. Um, but they can be really, really terrible for a lot of people, especially if violence is a part of that. And it's important to remember that these are very, very difficult things to navigate for people, and it's not as easy as just leaving. Um, and there can be a lot of really manipulative behavior that really keeps people in these types of relationships. So it's really not a sign of weakness or anything like that when people stay in relationships that maybe are not safe. So that's where your chapter ends. And so, I've talked, there's a lot of information in this book, and so I've only talked about some of the particular aspects that I find to be really particularly important. But of course, you'll want to know all of the elements from your chapter. Um, all right, that's all for this chapter. I'll see you next time.